Dan, today we're thinking about living for God. Let's explore the expression whole life discipleship. What do we mean by that?
Yeah, whole life discipleship was a phrase that was originally coined by LICC, which is the London Institute of Contemporary Christianity, which was originally set up by John Stott. And basically, it's about equipping and enabling Christians to live as disciples, as followers of Jesus in their everyday lives. At the moment, about 7% of the UK population go to church on a Sunday. That's about 1 in every 13 people. That can sometimes make us feel a bit marginalised and a bit kind of in the corner with everybody else against us. Of course, the great truth is that it's a fantastic missional opportunity, because for every one Christian, they're rubbing up alongside 13 non-Christians.
Of course, the only time when we are actually together is on a Sunday morning when we're gathered for worship.
That's very true. That's our gathered church moment, and we think that's a really important moment. But actually, Christians spend most of their time scattered throughout the world, if you like. And so it's about helping those people to see that that's a great missional, evangelistic opportunity. But that might take a bit of a culture change, a bit of a culture shift in our churches.
So let's develop this idea of whole life discipleship a bit more then.
Yeah, the central point of all this is that we all have 168 hours in our week. Now let's just say that you're going to sleep for about 48 of those. That leaves you with 120 hours every week. Now of those 120 hours, the maximum that any person could give to church activities would be 10 hours a week. So that might be Sunday morning service, that might be a home group or a small group, they might volunteer at a youth club or a luncheon club or something like that. Maximum 10 hours a week, and that's an awful lot, to be honest, to try and do that. But that leaves everyone with 110 hours a week. So 110 hours when you're not asleep and you're not at church.
And that's a lot of hours. That's the vast majority of our lives.
It is. It's the majority of everyone's lives. The problem is that in church, what we've often done is focused on the 10 hours. So somebody arrives at church, they want to serve God, they can play a musical instrument, so we put them in the worship team. Somebody arrives at church and they want to serve God and they're good with children, so we put them in Sunday school. Or they arrive and they want to serve God and they're friendly, so we put them on the welcome team. And all of our focus can end up being about those 10 hours, and we can end up ignoring the 110 hours.
What's the result of that then?
I think there can be a few outcomes of that. One major outcome, though, is that because we focus on those 10 hours, all of our mission and all of our evangelism can be about those 10 hours. So what we end up doing is projects and courses, programs, whatever they might be, during daytime hours. So we do food banks, we do luncheon clubs, we do children's clubs, all those kind of things. But we do them Monday to Friday during the daytime. Now, of course, about 70% of our church people are at work, or they're looking after their own children, or they're engaged in other activities during that time, so they can't help. The other thing we can end up doing is we put all those activities into the evenings or into weekends, and we say, come along and be part of this and be part of evangelism. But of course, people are tired in the evenings, they've got other activities going on, and the same at the weekends. And so what happens is people feel quite disconnected sometimes from the mission of the church. And so what we're trying to say through all of this is actually your mission is where you are every day for the 110 hours. What we do in the 10 hours is just there to support and add to that.
So can you give us an example?
Yeah, here's an example. A teacher once said, I teach an hour a week in the Sunday school at church, and they bring me up at the front and they pray for me. I spend all week teaching in a primary school and I've never once been prayed for. And the teacher said, that says it all. And I think that's very true.
So what you're suggesting then is that we need to encourage the folk who come to church to actually think of their 110 hours, the rest of their lives, as their missional field.
Definitely. That's their front line, if you like. Sometimes we'll talk about ministers or missionaries being on the front line of working for God. Actually, what we're saying here is that everyone, whoever they are on their front line.
Does the Bible shed any light on what we're thinking about?
Yeah, I would draw attention to a really key verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 17. The Apostle Paul is writing to the church in Corinth, and he says to them, "Nevertheless, each of you should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned to you, just as he has called you." Now, I think Paul is saying there that wherever you are, whether that's in work or whether that's in a family or in a sports club, whatever it might be, the place where you are is where God has assigned you and called you. Calling's not just for ministers and missionaries. Calling is for everyone. So when you're in that place, you should live as a believer while you're there, because that's your calling.
Let's try and summarise what we've been saying about this idea of frontline and whole life discipleship.
Yeah, if we were to summarise it, I think we could say that there is no sacred secular divide. There's not one part of life that's kind of about God and about church, and then the other part is completely secular. Actually, our whole lives are about God. Our whole lives are about mission and discipleship and evangelism and reaching out to the people around us.
We thought what it means to be the gathered church, preparing us to be scattered and so that we can live effectively on our front line and working in the place that God has placed us. Can we actually can we develop those ideas a bit more?
Yeah, certainly. The way that LICC have done that is to come up with 6 statements or basically 6 questions. They all start with the letter M, and they're all preceded by a little phrase or question, how am I? So the first one they say is, how am I making good work? And really that's looking at the whole idea of having a good theology of work, a good understanding of what work is about. That what we do in our everyday lives, and whether that's paid work or any other form of work that it might be, that actually it's not a necessary evil. It's not something that's in our world because of sin or the fall. But actually back in the Garden of Eden, God was working. And in Genesis chapter 1, he gives Adam and Eve the task of working, of subduing the earth and cultivating it. And so work is part of that. So it's a really important part of what we do, and not something that we should look down on or try to avoid or get out of as much as we might want to sometimes. So when we then look at, okay, how do I make good work, or how am I making good work? It's then thinking about, am I working well? Am I doing the best that I can? Is the way that I work and the way that I live my life, is it pointing other people towards God? William Tyndale talked about this several centuries ago, and said that he was talking about to be a cobbler or to be an apostle is all as one as to do it to the glory of God. And it's a great phrase, and something that we need to really think about is that our everyday lives we do to the glory of God.
So the first M is, are we making good work? What's the second M?
The next few really develop it a bit further, and they take on a few different things. So one of them is, how am I moulding culture? Now, culture can be just defined as the way we do things around here. So in other words, how am I moulding, how am I shaping or changing the way we do things around here? That might be in a workplace, it might be on a school playground, when you're dropping your children off, it might be in a sports club or where you volunteer or where you study. How am I changing the way things are done around here? That could be really simple. There's a story of somebody who was working in an office, and the people in the office weren't particularly connecting with each other. It was a little bit kind of quiet as a place and not very friendly. And so this person started to just make cakes on a Friday and would bring them in. They'd have a short coffee break, they'd have a cake, and then get back to work. As the weeks went by, conversations started to flow. And then after a few weeks, somebody else offered to make a cake, and then other people offered. And then they just started to have this great sort of rota of homemade cakes, and it became a real talking point. And the culture in the office started to change, and it shifted. Started from a very simple thing, just making a cake, but it changed the culture in that workplace. And that's, I think, is a really good thing for us to think about. How am I moulding culture?
So that's making good work, moulding culture. Another M?
Yeah, there's a couple of them. The last two I think are really important. The fifth one is how am I a mouthpiece for truth and justice? So when I see injustice in the world around me, am I speaking up and saying, no, that's wrong, or that needs to change? And actually, am I speaking truth into that place? And then the final one is about, am I a messenger for the gospel? So a lot of what we've talked about is about just living your life in a way that points people towards God. This one now says, okay, am I able to actually speak about the gospel? Can I actually communicate the good news about Jesus? Peter talks about being ready to give an answer for the hope that we have. And that's a really important thing for us. It's not just about what we do. It is, but it's about what we say as well.
So we've talked about the 6 M's. How can we actually encourage people to think about this in our church services? How can the churches equip us to go out and be scattered?
There's a whole load of things we can do. Here's a really simple one that can be put into practice. It's called TTT, this time tomorrow. So on a Sunday morning is to get somebody up the front of church and basically do a little interview, just a 1 or 2 minute interview, and just say to them, what would you be doing this time tomorrow? And they might say, well, this time tomorrow I'll be in an office, I'll be looking after my grandchildren, I'll be having a coffee, and they'll just talk about their life, and we'll learn a little bit more about what they do in their everyday life. And then in that moment you can then pray for that person, and it just starts to raise the profile in the gathered church that what happens on a Monday morning is important and is worth talking about and is worth praying about. So I think that's a really important thing we can do. Another idea would be to perhaps look at your church congregation and just see, are there some groups of people who are involved in the same work or the same kind of activities during the week, and that maybe they can support each other and pray for each other. So maybe you've got people in your church who are teachers or teaching assistants or work in a school office or a school governors. Perhaps get them together for an evening, talk about what their challenges are, how they can overcome them, and then they can pray for each other. I think that's a really easy way to do it. It might be a group of grandparents, or it might be a group of young mums, whoever it might be. Just get them together to support each other and to pray for each other.
Those are really, really nice ideas. What about things that our preachers, our ministers can do?
Yeah, I think if you are a preacher or if you have any influence on those who do preach, it's really about thinking then about how the sermon relates to everyday life. There can sometimes be a bit of a thing in our churches that in our sermons we end up knowing more about 1st century Corinth than about 21st century Cornwall. So it's about saying, okay, this passage in the Bible, how does it relate to my everyday life? How does it relate to my work, to my home life, to the sports and leisure places that I go? That might mean as a preacher going into some of those places and actually asking people about their lives. You might be chatting to people a bit more about their everyday lives, but then turning those sermons into something that's very applicable to every day.
There's a Living on the Frontline Bible study course as well, isn't there, that people can do?
There is. There's a DVD course and there's a book accompanying it called Fruitfulness on the Frontline, which is a really fantastic resource. It's great for small groups, just to provoke discussion, or if you're just on your own, get hold of the book and just read it through. And I'm sure you'll find some great ideas and concepts in there.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much, Dan.
Thank you.